The misstep. Officer Rachel Hammond had always seen herself as a protector of the city. A seasoned cop in her mid-30s, she wore her badge with a sense of pride that stemmed from a deeply ingrained belief in law and order. Raised in a strict household, Rachel had been taught that discipline and authority were the cornerstones of a functional society. But over the years, her rigid adherence to these ideals had morphed into an unspoken arrogance, a belief that she could easily spot right from wrong, often without question. Her career had been steady, marked by commendations for her diligence and bravery in the field. Yet Rachel's rise had plateaued, with promotions always seeming just out of reach. While her colleagues whispered about her brusque personality and heavy-handed approach, Rachel blamed it on what she perceived as a system that rewarded charisma over competence. That morning began like any other. Rachel arrived at the precinct early, her uniform pristine, her blonde hair slicked back into a tight bun. The precinct hummed with activity, officers preparing for their shifts, paperwork being shuffled, and coffee machines brewing the lifeblood of the force. Rachel's patrol for the day was in Westview, a diverse neighborhood that had a reputation for both cultural vibrancy and simmering tensions with the police. Rachel viewed Westview with a mix of distrust and frustration. To her, it was a place of potential trouble, a neighborhood where she believed the line between law-abiding citizens and criminals blurred. She prided herself on being vigilant, interpreting every movement and gesture as either a threat or a clue. Her shift began uneventfully. The streets were quiet, and Rachel made her usual rounds, stopping occasionally to inspect alleyways or parked cars that caught her attention. As the morning wore on, her patrol took her to the corner of a small family-owned cafe. The sight of a man leaning casually against the wall outside caught her attention. He was tall, well-dressed, and black, his pressed shirt and polished shoes starkly contrasting with the worn-down facade of the neighborhood. He sipped a coffee with a calm ease that seemed, to Rachel, almost out of place. Something about him set her on edge, though she couldn't immediately pinpoint why. She pulled her patrol car over and stepped out, her boots clicking sharply against the pavement. "Excuse me," she called, her tone firm and authoritative. "What are you doing here?" The man turned to her, his dark eyes meeting hers with a steady gaze. "Drinking coffee," he said simply, raising the cup slightly as if to emphasize his point. Rachel frowned, her instincts telling her there was more to the story. "Can I see some ID?" she asked, her hand resting on her utility belt. The man raised an eyebrow. "Am I required to show ID for drinking coffee in public?" he asked evenly. Rachel's frustration flared. She wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone she was scrutinizing. To her, his calmness felt like defiance. "If you've got nothing to hide, it shouldn't be a problem," she shot back, her voice tinged with irritation. The man sighed, his expression unchanging. "Officer, I'm not hiding anything. I'm just having my coffee." Rachel's suspicion deepened. To her, his refusal to comply was a challenge to her authority. "I'm going to need you to cooperate," she pressed, her tone hardening. "Either you provide identification, or I'll have to escalate this." The man's expression didn't waver. "Maybe you should call your supervisor," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This conversation seems like something they should handle." The suggestion felt like a slap to Rachel's pride. Call her supervisor. As if she couldn't handle a routine stop. "I don't need anyone else to handle this," she snapped, stepping closer. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for obstruction." The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, his face showing a flicker of disbelief. "You're really going to do this?" he asked quietly. "Now," Rachel barked, her hand moving to her cuffs. When he complied, Rachel snapped the cuffs on his wrists, her grip tighter than necessary. The man didn't resist or argue. He simply let out a quiet sigh and said, "You've just made a very big mistake." Rachel felt a flicker of doubt at his words, but she brushed it aside. Her authority was absolute, or so she thought. As she led him to her patrol car, she noticed the stares of passers-by. Some looked concerned, others angry, their whispers carrying fragments of disapproval that made her skin prickle. But Rachel pushed the unease aside. She told herself that she was doing her job, maintaining order in a chaotic world. Yet, as she started the car and caught his steady gaze in the rearview mirror, a nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning. What if you're wrong? As she drove to the precinct, the silence between them was deafening. The man didn't plead or protest. He simply sat there, his calm demeanor unnerving Rachel more than any shouting match could. For the first time, she began to wonder who this man really was, and whether her actions would come back to haunt her. Little did she know, her worst fears were about to be realized. The reveal. The ride back to the precinct was shrouded in tension. Officer Rachel Hammond gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale against the black leather. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of the man in the back seat. He sat calmly, hands cuffed, his expression inscrutable. His quiet demeanor unsettled her more than anything he could have said. Most people in his position would have been angry or defensive. His silence was unnerving. She replayed the interaction in her mind, searching for something to justify her actions. Yet every memory brought the same unsettling thought. He hadn't done anything wrong. No raised voice, no threatening gestures, not even an attempt to resist. Still, Rachel pushed that thought aside. He had refused her request for identification. That was reason enough, wasn't it? As the precinct loomed closer, Rachel tried to steel herself. The doubts gnawing at her were unwelcome guests, ones she wasn't ready to entertain. She was an officer of the law, and she had followed her instincts. But as she pulled into the parking lot and cut the engine, the man's final words echoed in her mind. You've just made a very big mistake. She shook her head, trying to clear the thought. She stepped out of the car, then opened the back door to retrieve him. He exited without complaint, standing tall and composed despite the cuffs digging into his wrists. Rachel reached out to guide him inside, but he stepped forward on his own, walking with the confidence of someone entirely unbothered by his situation. The precinct was buzzing with its usual activity. Officers shuffled papers, answered phones, and moved in and out of the bullpen. But the moment Rachel walked in with the man, conversations hushed, heads turned, and the atmosphere shifted. She felt the weight of her colleagues' stares as they took in the sight of her escorting a cuffed, well-dressed man into the booking area. Who's that? A younger officer murmured to his partner. No idea, came the reply. But Hammond looks tense. Rachel ignored the whispers and marched toward the processing desk. The desk clerk, Marcy, a sharp-eyed veteran of the precinct, raised an eyebrow as Rachel approached. Obstruction, Rachel muttered, handing over the hastily filled-out paperwork. Refused to comply. Marcy looked at the paperwork, then at the man standing behind Rachel. Obstruction, she repeated, her tone skeptical. Doesn't seem like he put up much of a fight. He resisted questioning, Rachel snapped. Just process him. Marcy hesitated, her gaze lingering on the man for a moment longer before nodding and beginning to input the details. Rachel stood stiffly by the desk, trying to ignore the curious glances from her colleagues. The man said nothing, his calm presence a silent counterpoint to Rachel's growing agitation. Officer Hammond, a sharp voice called from behind her. Rachel turned to see Lieutenant Angela Davis, the commanding officer of the precinct. Davis was a no-nonsense leader, known for her unflinching approach to discipline and her keen ability to read people. Her dark eyes bore into Rachel, and her lips were pressed into a thin line. In my office. Now. Rachel swallowed hard. She glanced at Marcy, who shrugged as if to say, You're on your own. The man said nothing, watching Rachel with an expression that seemed to suggest he already knew how this was going to end. Rachel followed Davis to her office, her heart pounding. The door closed behind her with a heavy thud, and the lieutenant turned to face her. What's going on, Hammond? Davis demanded, her tone sharp. Who is that man you just brought in? Rachel stiffened. He was acting suspiciously, refused to show ID, and— "Stop," Davis interrupted, holding up a hand. "You're telling me you arrested someone for drinking coffee in public?" "No, ma'am," Rachel said defensively. "He was obstructing." "Obstructing what?" Davis snapped. "Hammond, do you even know who that man is?" Rachel frowned, confusion mixing with a growing sense of dread. "No, ma'am," she admitted. Davis exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of her nose. "That man is Captain Marcus Hayes, your new commanding officer." The words hit Rachel like a punch to the gut. She stared at Davis, her mind scrambling to make sense of what she had just heard. "Captain," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Davis said, her tone biting. "He was assigned to this precinct last week. He came in today to observe operations, undercover. And you just arrested him." Rachel's stomach churned. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the enormity of her mistake settled over her. She had cuffed her new captain. Worse, she had treated him with hostility and suspicion based solely on her own assumptions. Davis leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "Do you have any idea how bad this looks? For you? For this precinct? We're already under scrutiny, and now our newest captain has been dragged in here like a common criminal. By one of his own officers." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her throat was dry, and her mind was blank. What could she possibly say to justify her actions? Davis straightened, her expression hard. "You're going to fix this, Hammond. Right now. Go out there, take the cuffs off Captain Hayes, and apologize. And pray he's more forgiving than I would be." Rachel nodded numbly and left the office, her legs feeling like lead. She walked back to the booking area, where Captain Hayes still sat calmly at the desk. The room seemed to freeze as she approached, every eye on her. Rachel fumbled with the key to the cuffs, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, unlocking the cuffs and stepping back. Hayes rubbed his wrists, then stood, towering over her. He didn't raise his voice or lash out. Instead, he looked at her with an expression that was far worse: disappointment. "You've got a lot to learn, Officer Hammond," he said quietly, "and I suggest you start immediately." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Rachel standing there, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like a stone. Around her, the precinct buzzed with murmurs, but she barely heard them. All she could think about was the man she had just wronged and the long road she would have to travel to make things right. The fallout. Rachel Hammond had never felt smaller. As Captain Marcus Hayes walked away, his words echoed in her mind. "You've got a lot to learn." She remained frozen, the key to the handcuffs still clutched in her trembling hand. Around her, whispers grew louder, colleagues stealing glances before quickly turning away. The once familiar precinct now felt alien, hostile. Her authority, something she'd clung to for years, was gone, replaced by a crushing wave of shame. She wanted to retreat, to hide somewhere she wouldn't have to face her colleagues or, worse, Captain Hayes. But retreat wasn't an option. Lieutenant Davis's words lingered in her ears. "Fix this, Hammond." How? How could she fix a mistake this monumental? Back at her desk, Rachel sank into her chair and stared blankly at the stack of papers in front of her. For years, she had told herself she was a good cop, dedicated, disciplined, and unyielding in her pursuit of justice. But today had shattered that illusion. Her actions weren't just a mistake. They were a reflection of something deeper, something she didn't want to face. Her own biases. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a chair scraping nearby. Officer Harris, a seasoned officer with a reputation for his calm demeanor, sat down across from her. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned back in his chair and studied her with a thoughtful expression. Rachel broke the silence. "If you're here to lecture me, don't bother. I've heard enough for one day." Harris raised an eyebrow. "I'm not here to lecture you, Hammond. I'm here because I know what it feels like to screw up." She scoffed. "I doubt you've ever screwed up this badly." He chuckled, A low, humorless sound. Maybe not exactly like this, but I've made my share of mistakes, enough to know that wallowing in them doesn't help. Rachel glared at him. What am I supposed to do, Harris? He's the captain. I humiliated him. I humiliated myself. You make it right, Harris said simply. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. But if you're serious about fixing this, you start by owning it. Rachel wanted to argue, to tell him that he didn't understand the position she was in. But deep down, she knew he was right. The question was, did she have the courage to do it? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Rachel avoided the captain's office, focusing instead on routine tasks that required minimal interaction with her colleagues. Each time she walked through the precinct, she felt their eyes on her, their judgment weighing heavily. By the time her shift ended, she was exhausted, though not from physical exertion. The mental and emotional toll had left her drained. That night, she sat in her small apartment, staring at the blank screen of her laptop. The TV was off, the room silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. She couldn't stop replaying the events of the day. Every moment seared into her memory. The confrontation, the arrest, the revelation, and Hayes's calm, measured disappointment. Rachel reached for her phone and hesitated. She had considered calling her sister, Natalie, for advice. Natalie, a public defender, had always been the voice of reason in Rachel's life. But Rachel wasn't ready to face her sister's inevitable disapproval. Instead, she opened her laptop and began typing. The words came slowly at first, halting and uncertain. But as she wrote, they began to flow, her thoughts spilling onto the screen. She wrote about her upbringing, her belief in discipline and authority, and how those beliefs had shaped her view of the world. She wrote about her career, the pride she had once felt in wearing the badge, and the doubts that had begun to creep in over the years. And she wrote about the man she had wronged, the man whose calm presence had forced her to confront the worst parts of herself. When she finished, she sat back and stared at the screen. The document wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was honest. For the first time, Rachel allowed herself to acknowledge her flaws without trying to justify them. The next morning, Rachel arrived at the precinct early. The tension from the day before still lingered, but she was determined to start making amends. She approached Captain Hayes's office, her heart pounding. The door was ajar, and she could see him inside, reviewing paperwork. She knocked lightly. "Captain Hayes, do you have a moment?" Hayes looked up, his expression unreadable. "Come in." Rachel stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure of where to begin. Finally, she said, "I owe you an apology, sir, for yesterday." Hayes set his pen down and leaned back in his chair. "Go on." Rachel took a deep breath. "I was wrong. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I treated you in a way that was completely unprofessional. I'm ashamed of how I acted." Hayes studied her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. "And what have you learned from this, Officer Hammond?" Rachel hesitated. "That I need to do better," she said finally. "Not just as an officer, but as a person. I can't undo what happened, but I want to learn from it. To be better." Hayes nodded slowly. "Good. Because this isn't just about you, Hammond. It's about the culture of this precinct and the example we set for each other and the community. You have a long way to go, but admitting your mistake is the first step." Rachel nodded. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Hayes leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "I don't need promises, Hammond. I need action. Let your work speak for itself." As Rachel left his office, she felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, she felt ready to walk it. The turning point. Rachel Hammond had never felt so exposed. Every glance from her colleagues, every whisper in the precinct halls, felt like a pointed reminder of her failure. Even as days turned into weeks, the weight of her mistake with Captain Hayes didn't ease. If anything, it grew heavier as she began to truly reflect on her actions. The precinct buzzed with its usual rhythm, but Rachel felt like an outsider. Conversations seemed to pause when she entered a room, and the camaraderie she had once shared with her fellow officers now felt distant. She couldn't blame them. Her actions had embarrassed the precinct, jeopardized their fragile relationship with the community, and disrespected the man now tasked with leading them. Rachel had always prided herself on her resilience, her ability to bounce back from difficult situations. But this wasn't just about recovering. It was about rebuilding. And rebuilding meant starting from the ground up. It was a dreary Monday morning when Rachel's first real opportunity to make amends presented itself. Captain Hayes had called for a precinct-wide meeting in the community center of Westview, the very neighborhood where she had made the arrest. The topic: bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community. Rachel's stomach churned as she walked into the brightly lit hall, her polished boots squeaking faintly against the tiled floor. Officers filled the room, their blue uniforms a stark contrast to the casual attire of the community members who had gathered. A long table was set up at the front, where Hayes stood, talking with a few residents. Rachel kept to the back, hoping to blend in, but Hayes noticed her immediately. He gave her a brief nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement, and returned to his conversation. She felt her cheeks flush and quickly took a seat in the corner. The meeting began with Hayes addressing the crowd. His voice was calm but firm, commanding attention without raising it. He spoke about the challenges the precinct faced, acknowledging the mistakes of the past while emphasizing the need for progress. He talked about accountability, trust, and respect, weaving his words with the kind of sincerity that made people lean in to listen. Then he opened the floor to the community. At first, the residents hesitated, exchanging wary glances, but soon, one by one, they began to speak. An elderly man in a worn cardigan shared his concerns about excessive policing in the neighborhood. A young mother recounted an incident where her teenage son had been stopped and questioned for no reason. A local shop owner expressed frustration at the lack of follow-through on theft reports. Rachel listened, each story hitting her like a punch to the gut. These were the people she had sworn to protect, and yet they saw her badge not as a symbol of safety but as a threat. She thought about the man she had arrested, the calm dignity with which he had handled her hostility. If he hadn't been her captain, would he have been another one of these stories? Her chest tightened with a mix of shame and determination. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could start changing what came next. After the meeting, Rachel lingered in the hall as officers and residents filtered out. She watched as Hayes spoke with a group of community leaders, his presence magnetic. He listened intently, nodding at their concerns and asking thoughtful questions. There was no trace of the arrogance she had once mistaken for confidence in herself, just genuine humility and a desire to learn. Rachel waited until the room had nearly emptied before approaching him. He turned as she neared, his expression neutral but expectant. "Captain," she began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I was hoping to talk to you about something." Hayes gestured toward one of the folding chairs. "Go ahead." Rachel sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since that day," she said, struggling to meet his gaze, "about my actions and what they represent, not just for me, but for the precinct and the community." Hayes said nothing, letting the silence stretch long enough that Rachel felt compelled to continue. "I want to do better," she said finally. "I want to understand the community better, their concerns, their experiences. I know I've got a long way to go, but I need to start somewhere." Hayes studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "That's good to hear, Officer Hammond. But wanting to do better isn't enough. What are you willing to do?" Rachel straightened, her resolve hardening. "Anything you ask." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Anything?" "Yes, sir." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "All right. If you're serious about this, I have an assignment for you. Starting tomorrow, you'll be working with Officer Malik. He's been running a community outreach program here in Westview. You'll shadow him, Attend every meeting, every event, and you'll listen. Really listen." Rachel blinked. Malik was one of the precinct's most respected officers, known for his deep ties to the community and his calm, empathetic approach to policing. He was also someone Rachel had avoided working with, finding his methods too soft in the past. "Understood," she said, though her voice betrayed her hesitation. Hayes's gaze didn't waver. "This isn't a punishment, Hammond. It's an opportunity. Use it wisely." The next morning, Rachel met Officer Malik in the precinct's parking lot. He greeted her with a warm smile, his demeanor as approachable as she'd always heard. "Ready to get started?" he asked. Rachel nodded. "Ready." Their first stop was a small elementary school in Westview. Malik explained that they were there to give a safety presentation to a group of third graders. Rachel felt out of her depth. She was used to handling hardened criminals, not curious 8-year-olds. But as Malik spoke to the kids, crouching to their level and answering their questions with patience and humor, Rachel began to see the value in his approach. The children weren't afraid of him. They saw him as someone they could trust. After the presentation, one of the teachers pulled Rachel aside. "Thank you for coming," she said. "It's so important for these kids to see police officers as people who care about them." Rachel nodded, though the teacher's words stung. How often had she failed to show that kind of care? The day continued with visits to local businesses, a meeting with a neighborhood watch group, and an afternoon spent at a community garden project. By the time they returned to the precinct, Rachel was exhausted, but also inspired. She had seen a side of policing she had ignored for years, one that emphasized connection over control. As Malik parked the patrol car, he turned to her. "You did good today," he said. "I know this isn't your usual thing, but you handled it well." Rachel managed a small smile. "Thanks. I still have a lot to learn." Malik nodded. "We all do. The important thing is that you're trying." For the first time in weeks, Rachel felt a flicker of pride, not in her badge, but in herself. She still had a long way to go, but for the first time, she believed she could get there. The struggle. Rachel Hammond had never felt more out of her element. Her first few days shadowing Officer Malik had been eye-opening, but they had also been humbling in ways she hadn't anticipated. Every interaction with the Westview community exposed cracks in her understanding of what it meant to serve. It wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about building trust, understanding perspectives, and most importantly, listening, really listening. But listening was harder than she thought. It was a Thursday afternoon when the challenge of her new assignment truly hit home. Malik and Rachel were scheduled to attend a community forum at a local recreation center. The forum, organized by neighborhood leaders, was a space for residents to voice their concerns directly to law enforcement. For Rachel, it was an opportunity to observe and learn. She hoped to blend into the background, unnoticed and unchallenged. But Westview's residents had other plans. The room buzzed with tension as Malik and Rachel took their seats at the front. Folding chairs filled quickly, the audience a mix of frustrated parents, skeptical elders, and impassioned young adults. A woman with a commanding presence and a clipboard stepped forward to address the crowd. "Welcome, everyone," she began. "We're here today to discuss ongoing concerns about policing in our community. Officer Malik has been kind enough to join us, along with Officer Hammond." Rachel felt dozens of eyes land on her, their weight almost unbearable. She swallowed hard and straightened in her chair, trying to appear composed. The woman continued, her voice steady but firm. "We appreciate your presence here, officers, but let's be clear. This isn't a lecture. This is our chance to be heard." Malik nodded, his calm demeanor radiating reassurance. "We're here to listen," he said. "Please, speak freely." The first speaker was an older man, his hands rough and calloused from years of work. He leaned on a cane as he stood, his gaze sharp as he addressed the officers. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, he said. "I've seen how things have changed. Used to be, officers knew us. They walked the streets, talked to people. Now, Y'all just drive by, windows up, like you're afraid to be here. Rachel shifted uncomfortably but stayed silent, letting Malik respond. That's a valid concern, Malik said, his tone measured. Building relationships with the community should be a priority. I'll admit we've fallen short, but that's something we're working to change. The man nodded, his expression softening slightly. Good, but words aren't enough. We need action. The next speaker was a young woman, her voice trembling with emotion. My little brother was stopped by police last week, she said, her hands clenched into fists. He's 16, just walking home from school, and an officer pulled him over for no reason. He came home terrified. Rachel felt a pang of guilt, her mind flashing back to her encounter with Captain Hayes. She had done the same thing, let assumptions dictate her actions. The woman's gaze locked on Rachel. What do you have to say about that, Officer Hammond? Rachel's throat tightened. She glanced at Malik, hoping he would step in. But he didn't. This was her moment. She took a deep breath and stood. I won't make excuses for what happened to your brother, she began, her voice wavering but steadying as she spoke. I can only say that I've made similar mistakes in the past, and I'm here today because I'm trying to learn. I want to be better, not just for myself, but for this community. The room fell silent. For a moment, Rachel thought she had said the wrong thing, but then the young woman nodded, her expression softening. Good, she said, because we don't need perfect cops. We need ones who care enough to try. After the forum, Rachel lingered in the recreation center, helping Malik stack chairs and clean up. The energy in the room had shifted by the end of the event. It wasn't entirely positive, but it felt hopeful. You handled yourself well, Malik said as he folded another chair. That was a tough crowd. Rachel shrugged. I'm not sure they believed me. They don't need to believe you today, Malik said. They need to see consistency. Show them through your actions, not just your words. Rachel nodded, his advice settling over her like a challenge. Consistency. She could do that. The following week, Rachel threw herself into community engagement. She attended every event Malik scheduled, from neighborhood cleanups to after-school programs. She began to learn names and faces, memorizing the stories people shared with her. She made it a point to walk the streets of Westview on foot, striking up conversations with residents and shop owners. It wasn't easy. Some people were openly hostile, unwilling to trust her no matter how much effort she put in. Others were cautiously polite, keeping her at arm's length. But there were small victories, too. A child waving at her as she passed, a shopkeeper offering her a free coffee, a teenager who stopped to ask her about becoming an officer. Still, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't done enough. There was a barrier between her and the community, one built by years of mistrust and misunderstanding. Breaking it down would take more than a few weeks of goodwill. One day, as Rachel and Malik patrolled Westview, they came across a small crowd gathered outside a corner store. A teenage boy was arguing with the store owner, his voice loud and defensive. I didn't steal anything, the boy shouted, his hands clenched at his sides. You've been loitering here all week. The shop owner snapped. Don't think I haven't noticed. Rachel stepped forward, her heart pounding. This was the kind of situation that could escalate quickly if not handled carefully. Hey, she said gently, placing herself between the boy and the shop owner. What's going on here? The boy looked at her, his eyes wide with fear. I didn't take anything, I swear. I just stopped to look at the comic books. The shop owner huffed. And you think I'm just supposed to take your word for it? Rachel turned to the shop owner, her tone calm but firm. Let's check the security cameras. If he didn't take anything, then there's no problem, right? The shop owner hesitated, then nodded. Fine, let's do that. Rachel stayed with the boy while Malik accompanied the shop owner inside. The boy was jittery, his gaze darting around as if he expected the worst. What's your name? Rachel asked. Jamal, he muttered. Jamal, I'm here to help, she said. If you're telling the truth, we'll get this sorted out. A few minutes later, Malik emerged from the store with the shop owner, who looked sheepish. He didn't take anything, the shop owner admitted. Sorry, kid. Jamal's shoulders sagged with relief, but Rachel could see the hurt in his eyes. She crouched down to his level. You okay? He nodded but didn't meet her gaze. People always think I'm trouble, he said quietly. Rachel's heart ached at his words. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Not everyone, Jamal. And I'll make sure they don't bother you again. You're not alone. That evening, Rachel couldn't stop thinking about Jamal. She had spent years assuming that she knew people based on their appearances or their actions. But now, she was beginning to see how much harm those assumptions could cause. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. And that was enough to keep her going. Redemption. The precinct was unusually quiet as Rachel Hammond stepped inside that morning. Conversations were muted, and the usual hum of activity seemed subdued. The air carried an undercurrent of anticipation, a weight she could feel pressing against her. Today wasn't just another day. It was a reckoning. It had been months since her confrontation with Captain Hayes, months filled with grueling self-reflection, long days working alongside Officer Malik, and nights where she questioned whether she was truly cut out for the badge. Yet, through it all, she had found purpose, not in enforcing rules, but in connecting with the people she once saw only as problems to be solved. Today, she was scheduled to present a comprehensive report on her findings and progress during her time in the Westview community. The report wasn't just for her colleagues, it was for Hayes himself, who had made it clear that he would judge her not on words, but on actions. The conference room was packed. Officers sat shoulder to shoulder, the atmosphere a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Rachel stood at the front, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. Her palms were clammy, her throat dry. Captain Hayes sat at the center of the front row, his expression unreadable. His presence was a silent reminder of the journey she had taken to arrive here. Rachel took a deep breath and began. "Thank you all for being here," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Today, I want to talk about what I've learned, not just as an officer, but as a person." She clicked the remote in her hand, and the first slide of her presentation appeared on the screen behind her. It showed photos of Westview, children playing in the park, shopkeepers tending to their stores, elderly residents chatting on stoops. Rachel turned to face the room. "When I started this assignment, I thought I knew this neighborhood. I thought I understood its challenges, its people. But I was wrong. What I saw as problems were, in many cases, symptoms of something deeper, a lack of trust. And that lack of trust didn't happen overnight. It was built, brick, by years of misunderstandings, biases, and failures on our part." She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, every eye on her. "I spent these past months working alongside Officer Malik," she continued, nodding toward her colleague, who gave her an encouraging smile. "He taught me the value of listening, of showing up not as an enforcer, but as a partner. And through that work, I've begun to understand what it means to serve this community." She advanced to the next slide, which displayed statistics: a 15% reduction in community complaints, a 20% increase in participation in neighborhood programs, and an overall improvement in relations between residents and the precinct. "These numbers are a start," Rachel said, "but they're not enough. Because trust isn't built in months. It's built over years, through consistent actions. We have to show the people of Westview that we're here for them, not just to police them." As the presentation continued, Rachel shared stories that had touched her deeply. She talked about Jamal, the teenager falsely accused of stealing, and how she had worked with him and his school to start a mentorship program. She spoke about a single mother who had shared her fear of calling the police, worried it would only make things worse. And she recounted how those same people had slowly begun to trust her, not because of her badge, but because of her actions. When she finished, the room was quiet. For a moment, Rachel wondered if she had failed to reach them. Then, slowly, Malik began to clap. Others joined in, the applause growing until it filled the room. Rachel's chest swelled with a mixture of relief and pride. Captain Hayes stood, silencing the applause with a raised hand. He walked to the podium, his expression still unreadable. Rachel's heart pounded as he looked at her, his gaze piercing. "You've come a long way, Officer Hammond," Hayes said, his voice steady. "When you started this journey, I wasn't sure if you had what it takes to change. But today, you've proven me wrong. Not because of your words, but because of your actions." Rachel felt her throat tighten, but she managed to nod. "Thank you, sir." Hayes turned to address the room. "Let this be a lesson to all of us. Change isn't easy, and it isn't comfortable, but it's necessary. Officer Hammond has shown us that it's possible, even when the odds seem stacked against us. And if she can do it, so can we." In the days that followed, Rachel's role in the precinct began to shift. She was no longer the officer colleagues whispered about in hushed tones. Instead, she became a resource, a bridge between the precinct and the community. Officers who had once doubted her now sought her advice, and residents who had once distrusted her now greeted her warmly. But the greatest change was within herself. Rachel no longer saw her badge as a symbol of authority. She saw it as a reminder of her responsibility, to protect, to serve, and to grow. One evening, as Rachel was finishing her paperwork, Captain Hayes approached her desk. He carried a folder, which he placed in front of her. "What's this?" she asked, glancing at the folder. "An opportunity," Hayes said. "There's an opening in our community engagement division. I think you'd be a perfect fit." Rachel stared at him, her chest tightening with emotion. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Hayes replied, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You've earned this, Hammond. Don't stop now." As Hayes walked away, Rachel opened the folder and scanned the contents. It was a new beginning, one she hadn't imagined for herself, but now couldn't wait to embrace. For the first time in a long time, Rachel felt at peace, not because the journey was over, but because she finally understood what it meant to truly serve. And as she looked around the precinct, she knew that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. Closing the loop. Rachel Hammond sat at her desk, the folder from Captain Hayes still open before her. She flipped through its contents, detailed plans for community outreach programs, officer training sessions focusing on de-escalation, and strategies for building trust within neighborhoods like Westview. Each page represented a chance to rebuild the bridges she had once burned, not just for herself, but for the precinct as a whole. The weight of the opportunity wasn't lost on her. This wasn't just a promotion. It was a call to action, a reminder that the badge she wore wasn't about power but service. Rachel closed the folder and leaned back in her chair, letting the enormity of the moment sink in. But she knew there was one last thing she needed to do before she could fully embrace this new role. The next day, Rachel knocked on the door to Captain Hayes' office. When he looked up, she stepped inside, standing tall but with a vulnerability she no longer tried to mask. "Captain," she began, "I wanted to thank you again for this opportunity. But I also wanted to say something I haven't said properly." Hayes set down his pen, giving her his full attention. "Go ahead." Rachel took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, not just for what happened the day I arrested you, but for everything that led up to it. For the assumptions I made, the biases I carried, and the way I let them cloud my judgment. I disrespected you, and I disrespected the values we're supposed to uphold." Hayes studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Apology accepted, Hammond. But I hope you understand that this isn't just about me. The people of Westview deserve that same accountability. And more." "I understand," Rachel said. "And I'm ready to keep proving that to them." Hayes leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I believe you are. Now go make it happen." In the weeks that followed, Rachel threw herself into her new role. She worked tirelessly with Officer Malik and other members of the Community Engagement Division, organizing town halls, mentorship programs, and youth outreach initiatives. She spent hours in the neighborhoods she once patrolled with suspicion, not as an enforcer, but as a partner. One of her proudest moments came when Jamal, the teenager she had helped at the corner store, stopped by the precinct to meet with her. He was shy but curious, asking questions about her work and what it took to become an officer. Rachel encouraged him to consider a future in law enforcement, not because of the badge, but because of what it could represent when wielded with integrity. "It's not about power," she told him. "It's about responsibility. If you ever wear this badge, wear it for the people, not above them." Jamal nodded thoughtfully, his gaze steady. "I'll think about it." Months later, Rachel stood in front of a packed auditorium at the precinct's annual award ceremony. Captain Hayes had insisted she speak about the Community Engagement Division's progress. As she looked out at the audience, officers, community members, and even some of the people who had once doubted her, she felt a sense of pride she hadn't known was possible. "When I started this journey," she began, "I thought I understood what it meant to be a police officer. I thought it was about enforcing rules and maintaining order. But I've learned that it's so much more than that. It's about listening, about learning, and about earning the trust of the people we serve. I've made mistakes, big ones, but those mistakes have taught me something important. We can only grow when we're willing to face our flaws and do the hard work of changing." The audience was silent, their attention fixed on her. Rachel continued, her voice steady. "Today, I'm proud to stand here not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who is committed to the process. Because the work isn't done. It never will be. But together, we can make progress." The room erupted into applause, and Rachel's chest swelled with gratitude. She caught Captain Hayes' eye in the front row, and he nodded, his expression one of quiet approval. Later that evening, as Rachel walked through the now familiar streets of Westview, she reflected on how far she had come. The neighborhood no longer felt like a place of tension and suspicion. It felt like a community, one she was proud to be a part of. Her journey wasn't over, but it was no longer weighed down by doubt or fear. She had found her purpose, not in commanding authority, but in building trust. And as she passed a group of children playing on the sidewalk, one of them waved at her, shouting, "Hi, Officer Rachel." She smiled and waved back, her heart full. This was what it meant to serve.